Hey everybody, this is Mark from We Talk Art. In this video, we're going to talk about the tools and materials to do pen and ink drawing. Back in the day, I'd get all excited about some art material that I want to try and do, and I'd go to the art supply store and buy all this stuff and just fail miserably. That was before YouTube. But now I like to kind of go over the materials you'll need to be successful doing it, and so that's why I make these kind of videos. We're going to go into the paper you're going to need, and then we're going to talk about pens that I've broken up into 5 categories. So we're going to talk about FineLiners, rollerball or ballpoint pens. We're going to talk about brush tip pens, fountain pens, and dip pens. So there's a wide range of pens that we're going to do. This is mainly for black and white pen and ink work, traditional pen and ink work, although you can use different color inks. So we're also going to go into inks, and then I'm going to have a little bit of a bonus section at the end, and we're going to talk a little bit about color. Before we get into this, I want to thank all the subscribers. I've had a lot of new ones coming on, but everybody who has subscribed to this channel, it is incredibly helpful and supportive. It encourages me to make more content, so thank you so much. Let's roll the intro and get into pen and ink. You may think that the tools for pen and ink are simple. It's just drawing with a pen, usually the ink's in it, right? Until you go to your local art supply store and get on the pen and ink aisle. And then you realize that, yeah, it's a much bigger thing and you can get a little overwhelmed by all the options. So I hope this video will make this sound a little simpler again, at least make it a little less overwhelming. I like to talk about the history of the art material that I'm talking about when I can figure it out. If that's something you like, then let me know in the comments that you like to hear the history so I can make an effort to get that information. In this case, pen and ink, like most art supplies, has a bit of a history. Humans have been using something akin to pen and ink since 3000 BCE in Egypt and Mesopotamia, using reeds with a carbon ink mixed with water or gum arabic, which gum arabic is the binder for watercolor. In 2500 BCE, the Chinese used ink with brushes to do their calligraphy. Then in the Renaissance, artists like Dürer and Da Vinci started using metal nibs on their pens. In the 19th century, artists like Van Gogh and Beardsley made the steel nib pen much more common and made fine art with it. Believe it or not, the first description of the fountain pen comes from the 10th century Egypt, although it wasn't patented until the 1800s. So, humans have been using pen and ink for a fair while. Yet many of you probably got inspired by pen and ink from the 19th and 20th century illustrators that really made pen and ink popular. Pen and ink, along with various forms of printmaking that look a lot like pen and ink, really established that black and white look in the history of art. So the question becomes, how do you make that cool, amazing looking art? We're going to get into that. As far as techniques, this video is more about the art supplies of drawing with pen and ink than the actual process. I probably could make many videos on the process itself, but we're going to get you going. If you're just starting, I would look for some instruction from artists such as Alphonso Dunn's book, Pen and Ink Drawing, A Simple Guide. I'll give a link to this book in the description below. There are also tons of other sources you could use to get going with pen and ink, such as more YouTube channels, other video instructions that are online, books, or just diving into it yourself. If you are new to pen and ink, I would recommend not starting to draw from real life or photos, but actually find a pen and ink artist that you admire and do some master studies of their work, making a pen and ink drawing from one of their works of art. There are several advantages to this. When you begin drawing in pen and ink, you must learn all the types of marks you can make with your pen and how to use them. You then need to learn how to use those marks to create elements so that your art translates well, such as line, form, contrast, texture, and such. The master has already worked these things out, and you have the opportunity of working from their art and learning their approach to these problems. Once you start developing your craft, you'll be ready to start working from real life or photos. As you develop your craft over time, this can be repeated by studying different masters and learning new techniques that you'll incorporate into your craft. allowing you to improve over time. I usually start my pen and ink drawings with a pencil sketch, but many artists would encourage you just to dive right into the ink. This does have a lot of value in growing your confidence, and it does translate into your drawing. I personally sometimes will dive into an ink drawing straight away, but more often than not, I like to put out some reference marks with a pencil, even going so far as doing a full sketch. With pen and ink, because it's generally you're working with black ink on white paper, there's some things you have to consider. The first thing is line. Pen and ink has a pretty distinctive line, and some of the tools we're going to talk about have incredible characteristics to their line. So line quality is a really big part of pen and ink, and getting your line quality with whatever tools you're going to use is very important. Another thing you have to concentrate on is form. Since you don't have any gray tones, you'll have to create those gray tones using your black ink on white paper, and this usually is done by overlapping different lines to create different kinds of densities to create a dark gray, light gray, and going to white. You can see here I've just used a variety of crosshatch patterns to achieve the dark to the light. And here I've just used a scribble mark to go from dark to light. And then here I've used some contour lines to take you through that. This creates texture, and that creates a lot more texture. This will create a more even tonal range. And this leads us into the final category, which is contrast. Good art has good contrast, and pen and ink can create great contrast. Although again, your tonality is where the challenge generally is. You can create very black blacks and white whites, but more often than not, you want some tonality to your image. And this is done with processes like this. Now, the book that I recommended earlier by Alphonso Dunn, he has a whole range of different exercises in order to get that kind of tonality. Many years ago when I read Dunn's book, I did a lot of the exercises in his book, and this is one of the pages from that. And he suggests to make these 1 inch by 1 inch squares and work on your line quality, and then work on your cross-hatching and tonality, and then going into other patterns and so forth. These are somewhat more like a Zentangle kind of patterns, which is another thing. So I did this exercise, and then I gathered a few little things and I drew them up here. And so working these over time, you'll get much better at creating these line qualities, tonality, and form and contrast. One important element to pen and ink is that the tool has a big influence on the look you're going to get. And so to some degree, you think about what kind of look you're going to get and work backwards to what tool you will use. I'm going to show you a huge variety of tools and make a lot of different marks. Some of them are very similar, but many are hugely different. And so choosing the right or wrong tool, will end up making or breaking the image you're trying to make, or make what you're trying to do much easier. So I usually like to start all conversations about art supplies with the surface those art supplies are going to go on, because it plays such an important role. Choosing the wrong surface for art supply can sometimes cause the art, even really good art supplies, not to perform well. And that goes for pen and ink also. So choosing the surface is really important. For pen and ink, that is going to be generally paper. And pen and ink, as with all art supplies, generally works better on a better paper. Cheaper papers, such as sketch paper, cheap drawing papers, things like that, they will not perform very well for a couple different reasons. One is that those papers don't have a sizing in them, and that sizing in the paper is something that controls liquid products and how the paper absorbs them. So cheaper papers, your pen and ink, in some of these cases, especially like dip pens and fountain pens, you might find that the ink flows into the paper, gets absorbed into the paper, kind of graying out and not looking very good, or it may flare out, causing your line quality to look kind of out of focus or not sharp. The next thing I recommend is looking at the surface of the paper. So for pen and ink, you're more often than not going to want a smoother surface paper. Papers have a range of surfaces, going from a rough watercolor paper to fibrous printmaking papers to cheap sketch or draw papers to more higher end papers that have really nice smooth surfaces. you're going to want something a little bit on the higher end side. I like to start with a mixed media paper that has a smooth surface to it. Some mixed media papers have too much tooth, too much texture to do pen and ink justice. You will find that there's papers out there that are specifically for pen and ink or markers. Both will work very well, but they'll have a super smooth surface. Sometimes you'll like that, sometimes you won't. Sometimes when you're drawing with a pen, you want a certain amount of feedback from the paper on the pen. If it's too smooth, you may feel like the pen glides too easily over the paper, making it hard to control. But most pen and ink papers should do a really good job. Some of the papers that you'll probably want to be looking at are going to be a Bristol, which is a drawing paper, but it holds up really well to ink, and it comes in two surfaces. It comes in a smooth or a vellum. I'm going to be using vellum for some of these examples. Other papers that you might look at is there's papers that are made for pen and ink specifically. A lot of those are very thin, so you'll have to decide if they're really the right thing you want for your art. I tend to like anything that I'm going to draw on to be a little thicker, and especially if I tend to give it away or sell it, I kind of like it on a thicker paper, which a lot of the pen and ink and marker papers are really, really thin. I have an example of that here. This is a Canson marker paper. It is super smooth, but it's a fairly thin paper, and it tends to be a little transparent. You can see a drawing through it. And so for me, this isn't always an ideal paper, although this is marker and it didn't go through this paper, and that's why you would use a paper like this. And so making sure whatever inks you're going to use don't go through the paper is a good thing. Another paper that is kind of a go-to paper for me, especially in a sketchbook, is going to be a mixed media paper. The nice thing is for me is I end up doing a lot of different things in my sketchbooks, watercolors and gouache and all kinds of stuff. And so I need a paper that will hold up to a lot of different things. And so finding one that has the right surface that I can do pen and ink on, but still I can do graphite and other things on is kind of a challenge. So you're looking for just that right balance and texture. Another real popular paper would be hot press watercolor paper. Again, different brands have different levels of smoothness on that, and so you'll need to check. All of this is going to be finding the right pen and finding the right paper to put together to express your unique vision. So that's part of the being an artist. So yes, you'll want to test with all the pens I'm going to show you and the papers that you're going to use them on. And to get good at any of this, you're going to do a lot of drawing. So you'll, over time, find papers that will work for you. Starting point, mixed media Bristol, smooth. You can feel it in the store, something that feels fairly smooth, but not maybe too smooth. But you might try a smooth paper and a vellum paper and see which one you like. So there are a lot of pen types. I have them laid out all over my desk here. I broke them up into categories. Again, I'm thinking pen and ink is a black ink typically, although many of these pens you can put different color inks into. So I broke them up into categories. The first category I have is one that I almost forgot and didn't put in, but I figure I better because some artists like it. I'm not a big fan, but these are ballpoint pens or rollerball kind of pens. And so that's the first category. The next category is going to be FineLiners. FineLiners, sometimes referred to as technical pens, come in a large variety of sizes. This is probably the most popular pen to do pen and ink with because they're so easy. We're going to transition from that into flexible nib pens and brush pens. I have a bunch of those. And from that, we are going to go into fountain pens, which is becoming a very popular option for artists, and I'll explain why. The final category I'm going to go into is going to be dip pens. And dip pens are kind of the classic thing, and they have an unbelievable amount of variation you can get with them, and they have a lot of advantages as an artist, although they're not very portable and they can make a really big mess. So you've been warned there. And then I'm going to look at some other alternatives. And the last category is kind of a bonus category. We're going to go into color and what kind of color you might include in or how you might add color into your pen and ink drawings. And yes, there's other pens and other pen types, and I'm sure you're going to come up with something. You can leave them in the comments below if I missed your favorite pen. But for the most part, I think I'm covering a lot of the more popular options that you're going to find on the pen aisle and things that might attract your attention when you want to do some pen and ink drawing. So I'm going to start with ballpoint, and these aren't generally my favorite. One thing to keep in mind if you're going to use roller balls, ballpoints, or any variation of that is that not all of these have great inks. And so if you want your art to last, choosing the right pen that has a permanent light fast ink is going to be a priority. That's going to be true with all your pens. If you want your art to last, use good art supplies. But some people like ballpoint, or like this is a Hybrid Technica by Pentel. It's a ballpoint based or rollerball based, and then there's a whole range of other rollerball based pens out there. One thing that artists like about these kind of pens is that the ball rolls in the nib basically and applies the ink onto the surface. And so with the right paper and the right pressure and speed, you can cause the ball to skip a little and create different tonality, creating some different kinds of marks that artists tend to like. So you can create a lot of tonality by the pressure you apply on the pen. And this is not true of all the pens that are out there. And so artists that use these really like that ability to create contrast and tonality with these pens. And I can kind of understand why. Although, again, as I said, not my favorite. These roller balls can create different kinds of line quality and so forth. These Hybrid Technicas are kind of one exception for me. I do like these. They don't do the ballpoint thing quite so easy. They'll make really consistent marks, and they're probably more in line, and probably why they call it a hybrid. They're kind of something between a technical pen and a ballpoint pen. These are fun, a good pen. By the way, I'm going to link to all these pens in the show notes, so if you want to track them down, they'll be there. This is just a standard Bic pen, and I honestly do not know. I think Bic's ink is good, but you'll find a lot of ballpoint pens that may not have the best ink in it. So be wary of that if you're going to go there. So the next section of pens is going to be these technical pens, or FineLiners. This is a Pentel point liner, and this is definitely a good one. Probably the most popular in this category is going to be a Micron, which is by Sakura. They call it a Sakura Pigment Micron, and these pens probably what started this category. I'm probably going to get someone telling me I'm wrong in the comments, but this has definitely been the most popular in the US of these kind of fine liner style pens. Although many years ago in the industry, the popularity of this pen kind of got everybody wanting to make pens, and so companies that didn't even make pens came out with a line of fine liners, and so they're pretty much everywhere. The precautions I would say if you're choosing something other than kind of the standards, which is Pentel, Sakura. I have a Le Pen here, which is by Marvy. One of the things you're going to want to really make sure that you're going to do is get good ink in it. Make sure the ink quality. And that brings up one of the first categories in the inks that we're going to talk about, is that inks have different characteristics. The first is how permanent it is. Does it fade? Is it light fast? The next thing people are going to ask for is it waterproof, if they're going to combine it. And then some people who are combining these with markers, alcohol markers, want to know if it's alcohol proof. And usually that will say somewhere on the pen. So these pens have become super popular, and they're a really good option for doing pen and ink. And they're used by many professional artists. They have a lot of good characteristics. They're affordable. They generally don't make a mess unless you break them open. You can't really do anything that will cause them to splatter ink all over the place, which is not true of all these pens. They travel well. You can fly with them. You can do various things. They make a very consistent line. So the pen are generally in sizes. This one here is an 01. I don't know if I can make that focus on that, but it's an 01, which is a very, very small tip. and it'll make a very consistent fine line. Almost no matter how hard you bear down on it, that line quality is going to be the same. And that's their superpower. Most of these pens are waterproof permanent, but you want to check on that. Some of them are alcohol resistant. The ones by Copic has a line of FineLiners that are alcohol resistant, so you can combine these with alcohol markers. And because of those characteristics, they mix with other products really well. A real common thing is to use these with watercolor in a line over wash or wash over line situation. You may do a drawing and then apply watercolors over the top of that drawing. You're not going to cause these inks to flow or spread or blend in with your watercolors. The downsides of these pens is they're usually disposable. The other downside for these is you generally have to use the ink that's in them, which isn't bad. They're generally a good ink, and if you read the pen or the advertising for the pen, you're going to see if they have the characteristics you want. I don't find that these inks are always the blackest of inks, and so tonality and surface quality and things like that may vary quite a bit in inks, and that sometimes pushes people to other pens where they have more flexibility with their inks. The flow out of these pens can be somewhat limiting. If I pick up a general pen like this is an 05 point liner and just do a mark with it, if I do it nice and controlled, I'm going to get a nice dark mark, but if you do it fast, sometimes you can find that your mark will start to gray out. And that's flow. And if you do it continuously like that, you're going to find your flow will start to fade. These pens typically have ink in a reservoir that might be in some kind of cotton or fiber, and then they'll have a feed that takes the ink in, so it supplies it to the nib, and its ability to supply ink to that nib can vary depending on the brand and so forth. So if you like to draw really fast, the flow rate of these pens sometimes can get in the way of that. Most people won't have a problem, but some of these other pens have a much higher flow rate, which can be good and have its own challenges. The smaller nibs tend to wear out. You should be aware of that, and that's sometimes you'll find that with those smaller pens, you end up wearing out the nib before you run out of ink, which is always a unhappy situation. And then the other downside is one of the upsides, is they make super consistent lines. And so if you are trying to get any kind of expressive line with these, they're not going to do it. They make a very consistent line. And for certain types of work, that's great. And some kinds of people like that real consistency. If you're going to want any kind of a character to your line, you're going to be able to look into other pens. As I said earlier, a lot of companies make these fine liner type pens. Some of the more popular brands, again, as I said, the Sakura Pigma Micron is going to be a big one. This is probably going to be the one you're going to find in your local art supply store or possibly even hobby stores because it's so popular, has a big rack, and it even comes with different colors. I'm not a huge fan of all the different colors. I've used them a couple times. I'll show you an example on the screen, but it's very illustrative look, so it's not really my thing, but I'm going to talk about other options for color at the end. There's one of the few. The other company that makes a lot of colors is going to be the Le Pen, and Le Pen has their line of these kind of pens also. And theirs is the Le Pen Drawing, and that's a popular pen also. And Le Pen also makes a lot of colors in these fine liners also. Faber-Castell makes a line of these, the Faber-Castell Pitt pens, and I have a few different varieties of those that they make. And then the Uni Pen is another very popular. This is more popular, I think, in Europe and possibly Asia. They're a little harder to find in the United States. A lot of artists like these a lot. I see a lot of YouTubers using that. An interesting one is the Eddington fine liners, which I know a few artists who really love these pens a lot. Similar characteristics. Copic multi-liners, and that's all I have on my list. But there are a lot of other brands. My recommendation is, if you can, is try to get pens that either are recommended or in this line. Again, a lot of companies that don't even make pens started coming out with FineLiners. And I think there's a variety of qualities to them. I've kind of bounced around. I use FineLiners from time to time, and I was using the Sakura Pigma Microns myself, and then I've kind of moved over to using the Pentel point liners a lot. So the characteristic of these pens, as you notice, there's lots of them, and I don't have a ton, but maybe I'll use the pins since I have these out. But generally, they come in different sizes. One of the largest ranges of sizes that I'm aware of is, again, the Sakura Micron, that go from a very small fine pen. I just didn't want to come out of there. A very small fine pen to something that's very, very large. And so I have these lined up. This has a 003, 005, 01, 03, 05, and 08. That is really a pretty common range of these pens that you can get. The 003 is going to be the finest. Now, an interesting thing is that these numbers don't always correlate to the actual size of the tip in millimeters or anything else. When you go and you buy a micron, the case will usually have the numbers. This is a pen I'm going to show you in a little while, but like for instance, this one is an 02. And then you have to look somewhere else to actually find the actual size. But so the 0.2, the 02 is actually a 0.30 millimeter, so 0.3 millimeter line width. So go figure. And I think a lot of these other companies have kind of gone off of whatever standard that is. I guess I should look up exactly how these numbers correlate to what. But generally, the smaller number, 0.03, is going to be your finest pen, and then the ones that go up to like 0.8 are going to be much larger. And some of these may actually go to the actual size in millimeters. But to give you an idea, I'm going to get rid of this piece of paper and I'll throw some of these down so you can see them. This is going to be the 0.03, which they put on the pen nib as 003. And that's going to give you a line like that, very small. This is a 0.05. That's going to give you, again, another very thin line. And then this is a 0.1. You can see the line is going to get thicker. And this actually kind of brings up a point, is a lot of these companies sell a lot of different sizes of these pens, and I don't think you need them all. You can buy them, as you saw, you can get them in different packs of different sizes and so forth, but you're going to find that I gravitate to 2 or 3 of them that I use a lot, and then the other ones don't get used nearly as much. And so if you find a store that sells them individually, that's really going to help you out. Then you can end up buying the pens you need and not have to continue buying the packs. So this is the 0.3. And a 0.5. And a 0.8. And you can see that's getting into a little bit bigger nib. Now, other brands have a variety of nibs going up into calligraphy sizes. So other pen lines like Pentel and the Sakura make sizes that go up to be very large, even to chisel tip style calligraphy pens. This is a 3.0 in the point liner, which is the Pentel, and you can see it's kind of a chisel tip on this 3.0, and it looks like it's a little, oh, there we are. So the fun thing with a calligraphy tip is you can make a thin line and a thick line. Okay, so FineLiners, again, are really a great place for beginners to start, although many accomplished artists use them a lot. They're a really handy, easy, affordable pen that probably won't mess up your artwork on their own by doing something unexpected. It makes them very predictable and easy to use. The next group of pens that I want to talk about are mainly brush pens, but there's kind of a bridge pen, and it's kind of shown by this pen, which is another Micron. And this one has a designation of PN on it. I'm going to right side up. And the PN is a plastic nib pen that has a certain amount of flexibility to it. So as you can draw with a very thin line, but you can also press down pretty hard and get a very thick line. So it's like having multiple pens in one. And it also allows you to get some expressiveness to the line, which is something a lot of artists crave. So instead of creating a very non-expressive line, I can get some attitude to my line. And that's what's going to be a byproduct of most of the pens we're going to talk to from here on out. So the FineLiners are going to be very consistent about their line quality, and the rest of these pens have some aspect to them that allows you to make very expressive, interesting lines. Now, the other side of this, the FineLiners are very easy to use, and you'll pick them up fairly quick. Any of these other pens that allow for variation and so forth is going to be another level of dexterity that you're going to have to learn how much pressure you want to apply and how to control that to get the line quality that you want. Once mastered, these pens, though, introduce a lot of fun aspects to them. So we'll start off with these kind of plastic nib pens. So the Micron makes their PN line, and that's a fairly stiff. It's probably the stiffest of the pens I'm going to talk about. But they also, Micron also has a brush version, and that has a tip like this, which is a fiber-based brush. And that's going to be the introduction here, is that there's different materials that these tips are made out of. And they're generally going to be plastic, like the plastic Micron. It's going to be a fiber-based tip like this. And these fiber-based tips are going to be on the end of a whole lot of other types of pens and markers that apply for doing this kind of work. And I'm going to show you some of those. And then there's Tombow and Faber-Castell both have a pen type that they call Fude nib, F-U-D-E. And the Fude is Japanese, or short for Japanese brush. And so Fude is basically a brush pen, and these use a rubber nib to do that. And both the Tombow and the Faber-Castell have two types of nibs. One's a hard nib and one's a soft nib. And so to start us off, I'm going to talk about these Fude nib pens first, or the kind of the more flexible plastic and rubber nib pens. I tend to like these a lot. They're a really fun pen to draw with. They're the easiest of the pens that I'm going to talk about going forward, with the flexibility to them and the ability to control. And as a result of that, they tend to be a lot of fun to use, and they can be used for fine line and detail work, and filling in large areas. And so again, you can get a lot of different line qualities to this pen. One of the characteristics that you'll want to choose your pen based on with these is how much flex the nib gives, how much feedback it gives for different amounts of pressure, and then also what its flow is like. Again, flow for a lot of these pens makes a lot of difference in how fast or how you can move it without it kind of breaking up like that. And so again, these pens typically are fairly affordable, so getting a few of them if you can afford that, and to experiment until you find the pen that really works for you. I kind of keep, for these Fude style nib, I kind of go back and forth between the Tombow and then the Faber-Castell, which somewhere in this pile I have the Faber-Castell Fude nibs too. And very similar ink quality, might be slightly better on the Faber-Castell side. They use their India ink in them, which I don't know. These pens typically are waterproof and fade proof and permanent. So how that varies from this to the India ink that the Faber-Castell uses, I don't honestly know the answer to that. But again, the quality and the tone of the ink that comes out of this is something you want to look at to see if you like it and see if some pens do better than others. And back to the beginning, the surface, the paper you put it on will have a big difference. So you might find that some pens look very dark and nice on some papers and then not as dark or nice on some others. And so combining the right pen with the right paper, again, is really a critical thing. I'll show some examples of some Fude nib drawings that I have done. I often combine, so I'll combine pens. And that's another thing to keep in mind is that you can end up combining multiple pens for whatever characteristics or part of the drawing you're using. And I've done that a lot. So moving from the Fude nib, which is again the plastic or the rubber based, we can get into the felt based. And again, the brush pen by Sakura Micron is a good example of a fiber based, and it's going to have more flexibility than the Fude nib, and the feedback it's going to give is going to be less because it's going to be a lot more flexible. So the sense you're going to get off the brush tip onto the paper is going to be less, and so controlling the line width is going to require you to get better at that and knowing how to control this. It can create some very expressive lines, and I like them for filling in an area really rapidly, which is a challenge to do with something like a 0.01 micron. So you can fill in areas really quickly with these, which is kind of an advantage of the brush tip. They do use a lot of ink and will dry up fairly rapidly as a result of that. So this might not be always the best option. If you bought it in with a set or you add it just to do small areas like this, this would probably be a good option for you. But again, these Fude nib, plastic nibs can do the same thing. This is the soft version of the Tombow, and as you can see, I can get in here and create another area pretty rapidly. Might be a little bit easier with the fiber based, but again, I like these a lot. Just as a note, it looks like the Micron made a little darker line on this paper, on this Bristol. I don't think the Bristol specifically is sized. It's more of a drawing paper. And so you may find that some pens will be darker on this than others. Fountain pens are nice and dark on them that I've found. So again, matching, say that many times. So the type of, where you're going to find a lot of these fiber-based pens, although you'll see them in different lines, they'll often have a brush option. But pens like the Tombows or the Copic alcohol markers or the Faber-Castell water-based markers, they usually have, that's one of these guys, which is a water-based ink marker, and they come in a lot of different colors. This is the black, and what you'll get is on one side you'll get a fairly large fiber base brush, and then the other you'll get a semi-fine line kind of brush tip to it. And so these become very handy because it's kind of two pens in one. And then the fiber tip on these, the brush tip, which is fiber, can allow for some really great coverage and a fairly expressive lines with a little bit of practice. And so these can be a lot of fun also. And the water base typically doesn't go through paper like you will find that the something like a Copic alcohol marker will. And I have, these are both grayscale sets. You'll notice that I like to work in grayscale a lot. So what you're going to find with alcohol markers that you have to be really careful of, and again, pairing it with the right paper is going to be critical. But again, it will have, so this is a Copic, and it has a big fiber-based brush tip on one end, and then it has, this one has a chisel tip on the other. I mainly buy it for this end. So, but again, you'll find a couple things happen with alcohol markers when you're choosing the paper. The first of which is that it will tend to flare on certain types of paper, so having the right paper is really important. And then the other thing is that it will bleed through the paper really easily. And so if you're in anything other than a really good paper that's designed for alcohol markers, my recommendation is to put an interleaving sheet, another sheet in here, even possibly wax paper or glassine, and that will keep the ink confined to one page, especially if you're working in a sketchbook or a journal like this. The alcohol will go through the page and then the next page. So you can actually kind of end up with some unsatisfying results when you're using alcohol markers. I kind of stay away from these. I don't use them very often. I bought this grayscale set to play around with, and I like it, but that bleeding through everything thing kind of puts me off, so I stay a little bit away from them. Generally for me, I'm going to stick with more of the water-based markers, and the other thing is they combine with these other pens. So an example of that, if I get this really light gray and then I put down some kind of mark with that, I can come in here with one of these, this light gray, and go over it and not typically disrupt those. Now, you should let it dry, which is something I've gotten myself into, but you can generally put this over the top of something like a micron or a point liner and not pull that up if you let it dry for a minute. So now we're going to get into the real brush tip pens. And as you've seen from me showing you different pens, the brush category of pens kind of has a lot of different varieties of pen nibs under them. You had the plastic and the rubber Fude, and then you had the fiber base that they refer to those as brush tips. But there's a class of pen that it actually has a brush, and it's typically a nylon brush, and it has bristles just like a brush does and feeds ink out through the handle into the brush tip. These are extremely fun pens to use, except they're going to take you some time to learn and master. They are a challenge, and but are a ton of fun, and I think they're worth the effort to learn. One of my favorite of these pens is the Pentel Pocket Brush Pen. This pocket brush pen will sell from anywhere from $15 to $25, depending where you buy it. It has a brush tip to it that looks like that, and from here you probably can't tell that there's anything really different about this pen, except for it could look like fiber, but when you actually start using it, you'll quickly realize that it is actually a brush tip. The other thing that I like about these is they have a decent level of flow, and they've balanced that flow so you get some options to be able to put down a nice dark big area, but you also can pull it pretty fast and get some really fun dry brush stroke effects with it, which give it a very organic look to it. These pens are, for the most part, kind of designed to do sumi style work, and so they can do the sumi and the calligraphy, but most people here in the United States and so forth use these for doing other types of art, and they do very well at that. The pocket brush pen comes in a few different colors. They actually have a gray and a sanguine and a sepia. I think a sepia. So they're pretty nice. I find that on the papers that I use this with, again, surfaces, you hear me say that a lot, the surfaces make a big difference, but I find that they can be a little dark. On this paper, it's not so bad, but I've had other papers where I find that these end up being too dark. I do like the sanguine. It's a really nice color, and I've used it in different drawings at times. But for instance, that sepia is awfully dark, especially on this paper. There are several manufacturers that make these true brush pens. Pentel's one of my favorite, and I think most of the pens I have are the Pentel pens. This is the Pentel color brush pen, although it's black and white. This one has a nice long, almost approaching a rigger style tip. You can get some really, ooh, that guy's leaking out. And that brings up another category. So this made a little bit of a mess on my paper. As we're going into these pens, once we get beyond these nice packaged disposable pens, we get into a thing about these is they tend to be require a little bit more skill to use. They tend to be managed a little bit better. Atmospheric pressures and different things can influence them, and they can blob on your artwork and make a mess, and you have to be ready for that. You having a little blotter sheet off to the side to be able to go over and test the pen and get it flowing the way you want before you actually set it down on your artwork is a good idea. As you saw with that one, we've had some weather here, so maybe that's what pushed it, because I used this pen the other day. These pens have a flexible handle of which you can press on them to get more ink flow coming out of them. So you have the ability to control the flow of the ink, which is really a great thing to do. You do not have that with the pocket brush pen. You can see that the ink is extremely black. I believe that they have two types, and I don't know which one because it's all in Japanese. Ooh, it got all over my hands. They have two different types. One is a pigment-based and one is a dye-based ink. So be aware of that when you're buying these. And then the next thing is they have different size brushes that have on here. That one being a little bit thicker than this one. You can see that they have a different type of tips on them. And so that will be another thing that you will be, see? That's what happens. So you have to be aware if you get into this, you're going to get more messy kind of things. And I'm going to take a quick break and clean this up because I have it on my hands too. All the rest of these pens are going to have these kind of issues. So just be aware of that. I wasn't quite trying to point that out quite so literally, but they do make a mess. Okay, shirt change. Let's see if I can keep this to a single shirt video or a two-shirt video, single damaged shirt. So that's a pretty unusual thing with these kind of brush pens. I have never had the pocket brush pen do that to me. So just be aware of that. I think I was kind of talking about when my pen exploded that they either are pigment or dye-based. The pigment-based are going to be more waterproof. So if you're going to combine it with other medium, you'd want the pigment-based or a waterproof ink in them. And that brings up the other point with most of these pens. They're often cartridge-based. And so you buy cartridges to fit them. I've seen videos show you how to fill them with different inks, but for the most part, you're going to buy the cartridge and fit them in. And that's true of the pocket brush pens too. So they have these little cartridges, and these last a while, although I have done I usually work in a 5x8 journal, and if I really go crazy, I'll go through a cartridge covering that page. Maybe not quite, but you do go through the ink fairly fast. They sell the cartridges for these in 2 and 6 packs, and they're fairly reasonable. And then they sell the cartridges for these pens also that allow you to keep them going and save a little bit of money. There are other options. So a couple of the fountain pen manufacturers make some pens that are kind of akin to a fountain pen that you can load with fountain pen ink. Noodlers makes one, and a few other manufacturers. You can find them on Amazon in different places. But another way you can approach this, which I've shown in other videos, is you can take brush pens that are designed to put water in the handle for doing watercolor and various other things, and actually fill the handle with ink. And these also perform very similar to those. You would squeeze the handle, or in the case of like this Derwent one, you'd press this little feed button, and you can get some really nice ink effects. The advantage of this is you can fill it with the kind of ink you want. Now, with that said, is some kind of inks like indie ink will have a binder that's shellac or similar or acrylic. And if they dry in this brush tip, that's probably going to do your brush tip pen in. So kind of thinking about what ink you put into it and maybe not leaving these inked up for a long time. I believe this is Noodler's black ink in this one, which is a very black matte finish ink that I love a lot, and because it's a fountain pen ink, it typically works pretty well. I actually don't use this pen a ton, and it's flowing pretty well. This one, what I did is I actually took a gray ink and then diluted it out so it's very light ink quality, which is really great for adding shadow work and various things to drawings or watercolors and so forth. And so this is another way to kind of do the brush pen thing a little bit more creatively. This brings us to the next category, which is fountain pens. And this is really a category that's growing in popularity. Of course, they were used back in the day, and for all kinds of writing. Nowadays, they're not used as much. A lot of people do like them because of some of the characteristics I was talking about before. There's a lot of variation in the type of nibs that you can get with a fountain pen. You can choose what kind of ink you can put into a fountain pen. Different pens have different levels of flow, how much ink can come out of the pen. So there's a lot of variation you can get. So maybe not quite as much of an expressive mark as the brush pens that I was just showing you, but they're a little easier to learn and control. They're going to be, in a lot of ways, a lot more like the microns or the FineLiners in the kind of marks that you can make, except some of them have a flexible nib that will allow you to make a variety of marks, and that's what makes these really exciting. I will warn you that fountain pens kind of are an area where you can end up kind of getting yourself in some trouble, because there are lots and lots of fountain pens, and if you start getting excited about fountain pens, you may find that you will own a lot of them. And I'm planning to make a video specifically on fountain pens because it's a pretty big topic. Many of the fountain pens will have cartridges, and this is one of the negatives, is that different manufacturers have different types of cartridges they use. So this is a platinum cartridge that will only fit platinum fountain pens. That's another platinum. This is a Pentel, or excuse me, a Pilot. And then this is an international. You think the international will fit everything, but no, it only fits pens that will accept the international, which is quite a few of them. Super 5 will fit an international cartridge, and there's a handful of others. But Platinum, Lamy, Pilot, all have proprietary cartridges, and that's the downside. Now the Platinum, one of my favorite fountain pens for a few different reasons, are these Platinum Preppies. And what I like about these Platinum Preppies is that they are inexpensive. You can get them for sometimes around $7, and they have a decent nib, and you can get 3 different sizes to these Preppies. So I have the 02, which is an extra fine, an 03, which is fine, and then the 05, which is a medium. Now, Preppy is a Japanese company, and something to keep in mind, back of your head if you decide to go this way, is that German companies make a lot of fountain pens too. One of the real popular ones is the classic Lamy. This is the Lamy All-Star. And then there's a plastic version of this called the Lamy Safari, but the guts are pretty much the same. They make a great fountain pen, but the size, German nibs are one size larger typically than the Japanese nibs. And so if you really want an extra fine nib on a fountain pen, you probably want to get a Japanese fountain pen, of which there's a lot. But don't shy away from the German ones. The German makes some really wonderful fountain pens also. One of the reasons I like the Platinum Preppy is that they make an ink that I like a lot called carbon ink, and it is a waterproof fountain pen ink, which is fairly unusual. There's a handful of them out there. This is one that I keep coming back to because I like the color of it. It's a really nice dark black, and it works very well in a variety of different pens. In the case of the Preppy, you can actually buy the cartridges. So this is the carbon ink in a cartridge form, and you can find those in 10 packs. And that allows you to have basically a waterproof fountain pen. Now, the reason why that's so special is most fountain pen inks are water dye-based inks that won't dry and ruin your pen. So to have a waterproof fountain pen ink that doesn't ruin your pen is kind of an unusual thing. The main thing you want to know about fountain pens, if you decide to go this way, is you only can put fountain pen ink into fountain pens. If you put Indian ink, like this Higgins Indian ink, into a fountain pen, it will ruin it probably permanently. You'll have a really hard time getting dried ink out of that pen. So fountain pen ink only. And with that said, there are just tons and tons of companies that make fountain pen inks. So another one of my favorite inks is this Noodle or Bulletproof Black. It has it's an extremely black matte finish surface. I love it a lot. It is waterproof on some papers. So cellulose or wood pulp based papers, typically this will be waterproof on. It is not waterproof on cotton papers, something that I found that the platinum ink tends to be a little bit better at. These kind of inks, especially the Noodlers being waterproof, means that it's not really, in my opinion, completely waterproof. It's mainly waterproof. You can still move it a little bit with water, but it's good enough to combine with watercolor, again, on a wood pulp based paper. But with that said, there's just tons of other companies. Diamine makes dye-based inks, so these are not waterproof, but tons and tons of different colors. Another company that makes a lot of different colors is Colorverse. They're a South Korean company that a lot of their colors are based on science things, like this is antimatter, and it's kind of a gray. And you can buy their little colors. You can buy their colors in these little small 5 ml sizes, so you can test them out, make some kind of fun. But they sell larger sizes also. And I could go on and on about fountain pen inks. There are tons of them out there. For drawing, I'm a little bit more personally traditional, and I like black, and so I have a handful of black fountain pen inks that I like. The Carbon by Platinum and the Noodlers Bulletproof Black are two of my favorites there, and so those work well in all of these pens. So the Lamy fountain pen ink is not waterproof, and to some degree you might think that is bad. If you're not mixing this with anything else, you don't have to worry about it. But if you're intending to mix it with watercolor, you're probably going to want to go a different direction. Not necessarily in the pen. I'll talk about a solution to that in a second, but it will move with water. But don't rule that out for a lot of fun. As I showed in a previous monochrome video, you can have a lot of fun with inks that move with water. So if I take if you've watched my videos, I tend to like to draw simple trees because trees are easy. And I might come in here and a little bit of shadow work here. And if you take water, this is a water pen. It has water in the handle like the pens I showed you earlier where I put ink in it. This one is the way it's supposed to be, is with water. And you can take that and then you can hit this with water and make this ink just go crazy. And so this can be actually a lot of fun. And so that's a little bit more water than I would have wanted to put on there, but you get the idea. It pulls really easily with water, and you can actually use that to your advantage, and it's a creative, fun thing to do. Where if I were to take one of these Platinum Preppies that has the Carbon Black ink in it, slightly different tree. Now with all inks, as you saw earlier from a previous example, you have to let them dry for a few minutes. If you don't let them dry, all bets are off. They'll still move quite a bit with water, but given a little bit of time to do its thing, you can come back in here and hit this with water, and that would probably just didn't dry enough, but it's not going to pull much, and if you give it 5 minutes, it almost won't pull any. You can see that it for the most part is pretty stable and stays down. There is other kinds of ink I'm going to talk about when I get to the dip pens that also kind of bridges this between these two and how much it pulls. So, lots of fun things. I highly recommend fountain pens. I am going to do a full video on fountain pens because it's pretty extensive, all the different things. One last thing I do want to show with fountain pens is that the nibs on these fountain pens, often they'll tell you what the nib size is on the actual nib itself, depending on the manufacturer. This is the 05, which is the medium in this brand. Now, when you're using a fountain pen, one of the things that's kind of fun about them is most fountain pen nibs will flex somewhat. Some fountain pen nibs will flex a lot. So this pen is a Noodler's pen. It's called the Ahab, and it has a very flexible nib. I don't currently have it inked up, but it looks something like this. And the Ahab, of course, is the captain from Moby Dick, and you can see the whale tail that's how you identify this pen. This one is called the Demonstrator because it's clear and it has a cartridge in it that we're going to talk about here in a second. But this one has a very flexible nib. It allows you to get a lot of line width variation to it. It's a lot of fun. It does take a little bit more maintenance. Like the one thing I like about these Preppies is that they are almost like the Microns. You can almost fly with them, use them wherever. They generally don't make a mess. I've had one or two where the ink has flowed out of the cap or out of the nib just a little bit, but I've never had one of these make a huge mess on me, where this one is a little bit more finicky. If you leave this inked up for too long, it'll start to clog, requiring cleaning. And it can have a little variation in flow. The advantage of this pen is that it has a high level of flow, which allows you to make a lot of that expressive line work and move really fast and get great quality of ink on the page. The disadvantage is that it takes a little bit to learn how to use, and it needs to be regularly cleaned and kept in good shape. I kind of tell people that using this is a little bit more like a brush that needs care and feeding rather than like a disposable pen that you can use till it dies and throw it away. So Noodler's Ahab is a really great pen. So with that said, I'll show you that even like this Preppy, which has a fairly inexpensive, non-flexible nib for the most part, you can get some nice line variation to it. So in its normal configuration where it's like this, where the tip is down, you'll get one kind of line. But if you flip it over and draw this way, it will be a little bit more scratchy, but you get a much thinner line. And then in this normal configuration this way, if you press hard, you're going to get a third quality of line, which gives it some value to it. And again, the Preppy line has 3 pens. This one's the medium, which is the largest of the 3 pens. So if you have the 3 pens and you can get 3 variations, you can get a lot of variations of line. I draw some full drawings just with the O2, the extra fine, which is kind of my thing. I like a lot of detail, and so I draw small fun stuff. So I'm not using the medium a lot, but the medium is a great place to show this line variation. So that's its typical line. And as I said, I can flip it over and get a much thinner line. And then I can flip it over and press down and get a fairly bold line. And so again, these are 3 different line qualities out of the same tip. And again, you can kind of press down and pull up so you can get a little bit of a variation in line as you're drawing with it. These things take a little bit of practice, but fountain pens are a great option. One is they're not disposable. You can use them for a long time. You get a lot of line variation from the nibs. You get to choose the ink, and some of them require a little cleanup as a downside. But I've really kind of fallen in love with fountain pens, and as a result, now I own lots of fountain pens, of which you only seen a small part of my full assortment of those. I find that I only use a handful of them regularly, though. It's like any of the pens, you know, you buy a full set and you find the ones you like, and those are the ones you typically work with. Occasionally I'll pull one out to do a drawing and have some fun with it. Again, this Noodler's is a lot of fun, and if I know I'm going to be drawing a fair amount with a fountain pen, I might ink this up and use it. But again, I don't like to leave this one inked up. Where these with the Preppy ink, I've set these aside and not used them for a month or more, pulled them out, and they just work fine. So these are a great alternative to a disposable Micron, which gets us into the final thing. If the ink doesn't come in cartridges, so if you're buying ink in bottles like this or that, or these little mini cute Colorverse bottles, how do you get the ink in the pen? And this is another area where there's good news and bad news. So most of the pen companies have these little what are called converters. and they're proprietary to the pen manufacturer for the most part. So the top one's a Pilot, the one in the bag, and then this one's a Lamy converter, and then this is a platinum converter. So they're all slightly different, and they're just designed to plug into that socket that the cartridge is supposed to go into, and that allows you to then get ink up into the pen. And the way this works is, if you look at this, as I twist the handle, there's a little plunger in there that goes up and down. And so what you want to do is, when you put this into the pen, looks like this. So this is a Pilot Kakuno, K-A-K-U, with the little 2 dots above it, N-O. This is another really inexpensive pen. You can get these for about $10. I don't have much experience. I just bought 2 of them, so I'll be talking about them at some point in the future. But this one, I put the cartridge in, but I haven't loaded it up yet. And so what you're going to do is, this plunger right now, as you can see, is in the down position. And what you do is you dip it into ink, typically till it comes to the top of the feed, right about there. And then you're going to pull this up, and it's going to suck ink into it. And typically what you do is you push it back down and pull it back up. So you do it twice, and that will get you a full load of ink. And then you need to wipe, have a paper towel ready, highly recommend, and then wipe the nib off and put the pen back together, and you are ready to go. And that's how you'll use ink that comes in a bottle. And so again, if you get a converter and a fountain pen in a bottle like this, that pen is going to last you for years. I don't know how much you draw, but I think years. It's a lot of ink. This is 60 milliliters of ink. And so I can tell you, I don't draw exclusively with fountain pens, or a lot, but that's a lot of ink, and it'll last you a long time. So you can get a nice pen, a bottle of ink, and a converter, and be drawing and not feel like you're throwing a ton of these away. I am guessing that this bottle of ink is probably 100 of these pens, something like that. Don't quote me on that, but you get the idea. So fountain pens, great option for drawing, and they're really a lot of fun, and I enjoy them a lot. So if you're new to it, start with the FineLiners, but when you get a chance, start playing with fountain pens. They are fun, and they're kind of cool. You pull out a fountain pen to draw with, and people are like, "Ooh, what is that?" It's a fountain pen. So anyway, cool value. Disadvantages, and there are a few. They can be messy. They can sometimes blob down on your paper. Some of the, like the Preppies, I've almost never had a problem. Very rarely have I had a problem. The Ahab, a little bit more. I've had it sometimes blop out a little bit more ink than I've wanted to. So failures can ruin art. You generally have to take the ink out of them if you're going to travel with some of them. I have not found that the case with the Preppies, although I do put them in a Ziploc bag when I travel. Some fountain pens can get kind of expensive. The Lamy All-Star, which is an aluminum-based fountain pen, these things can cost, in some places, $30 to $50. You can spend noodlers. The Ahab is affordable somewhere around $27, $28, but they have pens that go into the several $100s, and companies like Lamy and Preppy and a few other companies have pens that will go into the low thousands, if not more, believe it or not. Okay, we're going to start talking about dip pens, which is our final category. It is a huge category. What you gain by going to dip pens and all the hassles of dip pens is you get a huge variety of inks that you can use. So you're not restricted to just fountain pen inks with these. You can use almost any kind of liquid paint or ink. So for instance, the Golden High Flow you can use with fountain pens. You can use Winsor Newton drawing inks that come in silver and gold, and you can use waterproof inks and non-waterproof inks and acrylic inks by FW. Dr. P.H. Martin's makes a huge number of different inks that work with dip pens, and lots of variation. In addition, you have this option that there are an amazing number of nibs that are made for dip pens. Now, a lot of these nibs are calligraphy, for lettering and doing calligraphy, But you don't want to shy away from them. They make some really fantastic marks, and you can have a lot of fun with them, and they're relatively inexpensive. There are a handful of nibs that are specific to drawing or more liked for drawing. One of my favorites is the G-nib by Zebra. It's referred to as the manga nib, and it looks something like that. And what you're going to notice is it has a very sharp point of which you can really hurt yourself with if you're not careful. But the advantage of this pen nib is that it has a ton of flexibility. And I don't know if you can see that, but when it presses down, it flares out and it creates a gap between the two kinds of that, and ink will flow out between that into a very thick line when you want it, or to a very thin line. And so these pens have they're a lot of fun to use. They'll make a very thin, precise line. I would argue probably thinner than you're going to get out of any fountain pen, but you can also press down on it and get a very thick line out of it. Another nib that's very popular for that is this Browse nib here. It looks like that, very similar looking, again, very sharp end, and a lot of these things here are for the flexibility and retaining the ink. The little hole in the middle is called the well. The ink will get in there and allow you to draw with this for a while. It's not like you have to keep loading this for every stroke. You get quite a bit of drawing out of a single fill of this, and I'll show you in just a second. This Browse nib is referred to as the Sterno number 361. I've also heard it called the Blue Pumpkin. I think it has to do with that look there, but don't quote me on that. So what these pen nibs work with is a nib holder or a pen holder. Depends on who you talk to, but nib holders are probably the more common. These are sometimes referred to as the pen, the nib is, but they have a little indentation there where the nib can go into. This one was something like that, and so well, that didn't go all the way in, but you get it like that, and that's your pen holder with the nib in it. And from that, you can then dip this in ink and make art. And so these are the two that I use probably the most, and you can see they're very similar. This is the Zebra G-nib, and then this is the Browse Sterno, or the Blue Pumpkin, I believe that's called, Blue Jack-o'-lantern, something like that. I don't know. But to give you an idea, there's some crazy nibs like these that will go out and make these really long, wide lines. It can be a lot of fun, great for mark making. And these bent nib, again, there's a type of fountain pen that has a bent nib like this called a Fude fountain pen, because you can use different sides and edges of this to create different line qualities. And then I have some fancy ones that I don't even know what the nibs in them are. And then as far as dip pens, a classic, another one is these things here called a liner pen, which will create fairly precise lines. Graphic designers used to use these a lot. And then I put a little bit of ink in here. This is a Higgins non-waterproof ink because I wanted to show you comparison to the Lamy that we just did. And I wanted to get so I'm going to use the G-nib, which is one of my favorite nibs. And you just dip it in up to that feed. A little hold. One thing to note about the nibs is you generally want to clean them with soap and water before you use them. Some of them have a manufacturing oil on them that will cause them not to work. So if you find that your nib that you just bought isn't working very well, you may need to be cleaned. But you'll see here after I dipped it into the ink that little hole in the middle now is full of ink, and that will allow me to draw with it now. And as I said, you can create really super fine lines with this. And they require a little time to master. So the line quality, again, you can come in here and create just super thin lines. And so when you get into making some cross-hatching patterns, you just can get some great effects with them. Very nice. And then you can bear down on this and get a really nice bold line with a lot of ink feed. And that's the value of these pens, is they can create all these different kind of marks. And as you get good at it, you can vary these marks and make some just really expressive lines. When I'm drawing small lines and so forth, I can get in here and draw for quite a while on one load. Drawing my tree again. So anyway, this is, again, another thing I just wanted to show you is this Higgins non-waterproof ink does some really fun things. Now, the downside of these pens are multiple. One is you have to keep them clean. You can't just set this aside and let the ink dry in it. This ink would be better, but if you were using something like this FW acrylic ink and you let that dry on this nib, it would take a little bit of effort to get it off. Not that it's impossible. And the nibs aren't terribly expensive, so on occasion you're going to wear the tip out or eventually, or something's going to dry in it. You're just not going to be happy, and you can buy another one, and they're fairly affordable. So back to this. So I've given this a few minutes to dry, and this again is a non-waterproof ink, and I wanted to show it compared to the Lamy ink, which moves a lot. This moves too, but it doesn't move as much as the Lamy ink, and so you can get some really subtler grays in here with this ink. And the sooner you hit this with water, you'll find that it will move easier. But one of the fun things about this one compared to the Lamy and some other inks is that the lines still stay there. It's very hard to get it to completely give up the line. And so you'll end up getting this nice effect of a shadow on a line, and it's a really good look. So it's a fun thing to do. A lot of these other inks that I'm going to show you are waterproof. So again, the FW has an acrylic binder. They have a huge number of colors in this line. This is the black, so this is kind of a black India ink. Golden has their high flow ink, which also will work with dip pens. It's an acrylic base. It would be very similar to this product here. And Golden has a lot of colors in this. Higgins makes the waterproof, the non-waterproof ink I just showed you, but it also has a waterproof India ink. They also have a range of colors for that. Winsor Newton has their whole drawing ink line that had all kinds of colors. So here's white, this is black. Now they have a black waterproof and a non-waterproof drawing ink in black. And I also have silver and gold, but they have a whole range of colors too. And they're in these cool little bottles that are really, the boxes for these are real creative too. And they sell sets of those. And as I think I mentioned also, Dr. P.H. Martin's has a whole bunch of different kinds of drawing inks. This is a Black Star matte and then a waterproof, Black Star waterproof Indian ink, high carb. These are really nice inks also. So the fun thing about dip pens is the exploration. Here's a really messy bottle of Speedball black India ink. I find the Speedball a little thicker. It can be diluted, and that's another thing is all these inks can be diluted in water, and playing with water is a whole other thing. I'm going to put the monochrome video up here after the end, and it'll be down in the show notes. You might want to check that out. I combine that with water. I'll probably do an ink and water video because there's just so many things you can do combining those. But you can definitely dilute these out to be less black or less colorful. So that is the range of pens that we're going to talk about. Oh, I do have this really broad tip one here, and if I can fit this in my ink well, I can ink this up and create some really interesting marks and lines with that. So huge range of things you can do with the dip pens. So they're fairly affordable. Again, all you need is the pen holder, which generally are just a few dollars, maybe $5, $6 for a nice one. They do make some really nice ones. I do like this one here is a Cornor one. It's not labeled, but it's a really nice matte finish. It feels really nice, high quality. I like that one a lot. Speedball makes some. This is another Cornor one. One slight note is that you can use fountain pen inks with dip pens. So that's not an exclusion. You can't use all these other inks with fountain pens. You only can use fountain pen ink, but you can use fountain pen ink with dip pens. And then the final thing I want to say about dip pens is that what is qualified as a dip pen has a lot of, is very open-ended. So for instance, keep in mind you can use brushes to dip in with ink, and I would recommend watercolor brushes as a general rule. They're going to work better with ink than possibly like an oil painting brush or something like that. Your inks may stain your brushes, so if you don't want your nice Kolinsky Sable watercolor brushes turned to color, you may use a cheaper or brushes that you don't mind getting ink on. So you can come in and just use ink with a brush. So brushes are a good thing. You can get them dark. They also make various bamboo pens that you can get. I know that Jack Richardson sells these and some other manufacturers sell them. They can make some very interesting marks. You can definitely make some fun marks with a bamboo. And then you can get very creative and just use sticks. You can either carve it into it or just pick up a stick, dip it in, and make marks with sticks. And so there's no end to what you can dip into ink and make marks with. And so I'd encourage you, if you really want to have fun, to try a lot of different things. I just picked up a handful of sticks from outside, and I didn't carve any of them, but you could carve an edge to them or carve them a little bit on the side and vary what kind of marks you can make. So another great option that falls under the dip pen thing. So I have to clean up this mess. Okay, so the final bonus section here is going to be adding color. The one thing that pen and ink does is you can make some really wonderful black and white pen and ink images, which is something I really like, but some artists like some color, and I get with that. So what I did is I drew a handful of my trees to give some examples of what you can kind of do with different kinds of color options here. One of my favorite is combining pen and ink with watercolors. And so I have my watercolor palette here, and I have a water pen. And so if you're using, I used this Micron PM pen that we were showing you a little bit earlier, the plastic dip pen, and I just drew 4 trees on here, which I thought I would show you with the different examples of how you can just add color. And typically there's different ways. Different people will talk line over wash or wash over line, and it's basically when and how you add the black. And so my typical routine is I'll usually sketch something out in pencil, and then you can add color and then do the pen and ink work over the top, which is actually the way I recommend. Now, I'm not doing it that way. I'm just going to throw it on, but you're going to find that you don't have to be very precise about the way you apply the color, because you can apply some shading with the pen, and the outline with the pen makes it very interesting. And so in this case, I'm just going to put a little bit of green in here and add this in. And again, I don't have to be terribly precise about the way I'm going to add this. But keep in mind, anything with watercolors is that you need to preserve your highlights. And so if you're going to have a highlight on that, then you want to be careful how you treat those highlights. And that's going to be typical anything. But because the watercolor is transparent, you're going to see your pen and ink marks through that. You can come in here and throw in some color here. And then I can come in here with something that might make a good shadow color and draw in a little bit of shadow. pull in a little bit more shadow work. And again, it doesn't have to be anything precise. Your preciseness is going to be with your pen. So it's a fun way to do it. Again, a lot of urban sketchers like to do it. And whether you do the pen work before or after is really up to you, how you do it. But if I let this dry, I could then go over this again and add more pen work to it. So the next category would be a water-based markers. These are a Faber-Castell water-based marker that I had shown you kind of earlier. I don't have colors in these, so two of these I don't really have colors with, and this is one of them. Tombow is another one. They have a wide range of colors. The Faber-Castell has a smaller range of colors, but they're a really nice pen. And so again, you can kind of come in here, and because the pen is waterproof, I can come in here with some light tones, and this is a palm tree, in case you're wondering. I might need to work on my palm trees. But the same thing with the watercolors is that you probably want to preserve your highlights. If this was color, you can continuously add more and more color, create a little bit of a shadow, maybe add another shadow here, and then just kind of work myself around trying to add to this. But again, because the pen and ink is kind of providing the precision to the drawing, you can be very, very loose with these. And then these, along with another one that I'm going to show you, can be pulled with water a little bit. So you can come in here and then take water and pull these markers out a little bit, which is kind of fun, and it'll soften them up so you'll have less of a marker look to it. That water-based marker will move with water, which is adds to the fun of that one. So these are, again, water-based markers. The Faber-Castell has a little fine tip on one end, and then on the other end has a really nice brush tip, which is a fiber-based brush, not a brush. So kind of keeping with that water-based theme, another option with water-based markers are markers that are more watercolor. So this is the Faber-Castell Albert Stir watercolor markers I have here, and I just pulled out a green and a brown and a blue, and we'll go with this one. These are going to perform very similar to this. This is just going to be a higher quality pigment to them, and so it should be more light fast and probably give you much richer, better colors. You will again want to protect your highlights. I didn't pull a gray out, so I'm just going to do that. And then I can add a little bit of blue sky. Wrong end. This is so these Faber-Castell Albert Stir watercolors have a little thin point on one end and a fat point on the other, and they are marked here, but I always seem to pull the wrong cap off. So I'm just going to go and pull some blue up here, and I'll put it over this one too, but normally I'd spend a little bit more time and make a blue sky. But again, this will pull with water, and so you can come in here and pull this out. And it's good to have a paper towel so you can wipe off the color that you're moving around. And it should be noted that some of these colors, like in watercolor, are more staining than other colors, and so you may find that some of them, and paper's dependent, some will pull easier than others. But you can see my line work still stays there even though I colored outside the lines. The final kind of marker I'm going to show you is another marker. Again, I'm not going to show you the alcohol markers. I kind of showed you an example of that earlier. They tend to bleed through stuff. I'm not a big fan of the alcohol markers as a result of that. They're just not my thing. For illustration and some things, markers are wonderful, and some people make them sing. I'm not one of those, but you can definitely do this. If you're going to use alcohol markers, you want to make sure whatever the black pen you're using is alcohol resistant or added at the last. The advantage of using a watercolor marker with or a watercolor pen with any of these is that it's not going to disrupt this pen work. Usually. And so these are in India ink. So they're going to be a little bit more like a marker an alcohol marker, but it won't soak through the paper, and you get really nice vivid colors out of it. And they're light fast also, which is a big thing over alcohol markers. A lot of alcohol markers aren't light fast. So I'm going to come in here and make my, this is supposed to be an aspen in fall. Bear with me here. Oops. And these also have a fine tip pin on one end and a brush tip on the other, kind of like the other Faber-Castell, and they're marked here to show you. But like I said, it's a 50-50 chance I always pull off the wrong one. These, once they dry, they're down. So if I let this dry, I was going to add a little green to this. Might do this with the little fine tips section and just add a little green to that. So I'm going to give this a second to dry. Now you can see my black line work still works even though I put it down first, but I don't know if I've let this go for long. My blue's still on the brush, but this is not going to pull as easy. If you can catch it when it's wet, like this was still, I guess, somewhat wet up here, so it's going to move. But once it dries, it's down. So it's what is your process you want it to be. So if you want to be able to move it with water, then you want to use something that's more water soluble. If you don't want it to move, then something like these pit pens, given a minute to dry, would stay down. The final thing I'm just going to mention, which I was going to pull out, but I'm running out of time here, would be you could use ink tints or watercolor pencils on this and work with them that way. So the combination of pen and ink with color is really a great effect. You see it a lot in urban sketching and a lot of illustrative styles, some fantasy styles and so forth. So there's a lot of variation. Pen and ink offers tons of fun. You can take it many different directions. And so I hope you found this interesting. I hope you're inspired to make some pen and ink drawings. And if you like this video, please consider giving us a subscribe and a like. It helps the channel out a lot. Now, go make some art.